for the invitation to come. I really appreciate it. I was a Stanford undergrad myself, and have been really thrilled to be back. I spent most of my medical training and medical life in Boston. I'll talk a little bit about that, and then came back here about 5 years ago. I'm the Chief Medical and Scientific Officer at Verily, and I also attend at the hospital here doing inpatient cardiology. And what we're going to talk a bit today about is where the intersection of technology, life science, and healthcare is currently having the biggest impact. And I think also framing it in a medical lens, which I think is going to be a nice juxtaposition. My understanding is you've had other lectures here, may touch on even some of the technology, but I want us to be able to walk away and say, how can we have the biggest impact for patients and clinicians? And so one thing I mentioned, most of my training was in Boston, and I trained as a cardiologist, and a lot of times we talk about new technologies as if there's something that something that have come out of nowhere. And I think we frequently remind ourselves that we've always used new technologies in healthcare. So something like the stethoscope was around 200 years ago, and at the time it actually was thought to be this new technology. It was one of the first times that physicians weren't just using their basic senses, but were augmenting their senses to understand what was going on with the patient. The same thing's true. This is an electrocardiogram. We only have 2 people from the med school, so no one has to read the electrocardiogram. But it's this idea again that we use these tools as long as they benefit patients. In fact, we use many, many high-tech tools today that are reliant on very expensive engineering systems. So this advanced ultrasound I'm showing you on the left, there are tools that we use to open up arteries in the heart. Stents now that we can change the morphology of the valves. And there are even new molecular tools. So what we're going to talk about today is trying to put into perspective what we see and why now is a different revolution in technology that's built on this base. For me, it was, so I think you can tell I had training in medicine. I was spending time in our critical care unit at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And what was interesting is there were the patients that were in front of me, and then there was also this idea of how do you get the best evidence to bring new tools, technologies, medicines to patients. So I got involved in this concept of clinical trials and clinical evidence. And I think for folks who are very medically based, this will be absolutely self-evident. For people who don't spend as much time in this field, it's really important to know that any new discovery that we have in life science or in healthcare, we have to convince ourselves that it's safe and efficacious for patients. So we practice evidence-based medicine, and it was really a phenomenal time to be part of clinical trials in cardiology, because much of what we take for granted today, we really didn't know, and it wasn't, at least in my perspective, didn't seem like that long ago. So this idea of how do you get the right evidence became really relevant. But there were 2 phenomena that actually drove me to move across country and join Google X. One is this idea that a lot of what we see in healthcare happens in the 4 walls of the hospital. Or if you even think about the concept of an electronic health record, that is something that a clinician enters information in. But health is actually happening all the time. Right now, your body is emitting digital signals, molecular signals. And so how are we going to marry today's lens, which we think of in the clinic, to what's really going on with health? And we'll talk more about that. The second phenomenon was that our computing was failing us. And so there were questions that we wanted to ask. But a very tangible example is we're running genomes on one side of the street, literally on one side of the street. The clinical data would be in a building on the other side, and really marrying that data was more challenging than it should be. And in fact, it was behind many, many fields that were out there. And so I did end up getting a call from Google. At first I thought they were looking for the wrong person. This was now several years ago, before we had our health unit. But I took the call because I believed very much that the only way we were going to bring the best computing and the best technology into healthcare was to have the right people around the table. And so it was the story, I will tell you the story internally, is that, and I should ask, was anyone in Boston in 2014 or 15? Does anyone remember what the weather was like?
Yeah.
So what were we known for?
I believe it was 6 Mondays and Tuesdays in a row we had a blizzard?
Yeah, and it was insane. It was the snowiest winter of all time, and in fact, I had the same pager. I was really proud. I kept the same pager from training to when I was a faculty member, and I was shoveling, and I lost my pager in a snowbank, and it was so cold that it just froze in the snowbank. So the joke among the office is that I fled and came to California to avoid the winter. But the real truth, that's not the truth. The truth is that I came out and saw a group of really passionate engineers across the board, whether it's people with computer science. I was asking about the backgrounds just because I worked down with a very diverse range of engineers and met people who really were trying to make a difference in the world, applying the latest algorithms, building small sensors that we'll talk about. And it was a realization that you have to have those folks married to people who have thought deeply about how do you change the need on healthcare, what evidence do you need to really get clinicians and patients on board. So I ended up moving out here and have subsequently ceased all shoveling. So we were a group, we were a relatively small group within, in fact, I'll go back one slide. So Google X at the time, Google's mission, I think we know, is to organize the world's information. Google X was a group thinking about how do you apply these same kinds of principles, but in really focused and dedicated ways, frequently in areas that were either regulated or required a different skill set. So the group working on, at the time it was the driverless car, now it's Waymo, a group working on access and energy, and a relatively small group of us thinking about life science and healthcare. But I think because you guys are in the room today, it's not lost on you that we very rapidly became one of the fastest growing branches of Google X and ultimately spun out as an independent unit under Alphabet. And so where we talk about Google's mission is to organize the world's information, our mission is to think about what does that mean from the world's health information, and then how do we take this information and not just observe or identify, but actually intervene and help people so they live healthier lives. And I think that's a very important concept as you start to think about next generation algorithms. It's great to detect something, but in healthcare, really closing that loop is the way that you end up having the biggest impact. There's this concept then of what are the gaps that you can actually solve with new technologies. And it goes back to this idea that I mentioned. When we think about current healthcare and life science, we usually are thinking about a pretty episodic type of care. And so if you think about on the information side, right now, data insights can be fairly limited. And so I'll use the example of my grandfather had type 2 diabetes. He was one of those, he was a World War II vet, very diligent, would prick his finger 4 times a day. He had composition notebooks, the black and white notebooks, and he would write all of his lab values down. And then he would try to bring them to the doctor, and the doctor thought that was an entire terror. But even with someone who is as diligent, there's biology happening all the time, and I want to plant that seed because we're going to be talking about next generation tools to understand not just episodic, but really true biology. And the second one is the decision gap. Right now, people see their doctors typically when they're sick, but we're making health decisions every week, every day, and every hour. And so what I'll go through today, and then there'll be time for discussion, so thanks again for moving down. But an idea of what does it mean when you take new engineering and new technology and apply it in a space where it's relatively well worked out, something like diabetes. Well, where can you, I believe that the formal title of this seminar session is AI in healthcare, but I'll give you some really tangible examples of where we're seeing applications. But then I also want to plant the seed that there's probably every person in this room knows someone who's dealing with a health ailment where we don't have the right data set or we don't have the right information. And you can have all of the best tools in the world, but if you don't have those data sets and you don't have that exploration, we're not going to be pushing the future of healthcare. And the final piece, just in terms of the introduction, is to think about why now. I mentioned that we have been using technology for hundreds of years. But there is a revolution going on now, and I think many of you are part of this. And it's thinking about how do we use compute in a different way. And so not so long ago, we used to spend a lot of time thinking about where we compute, so where our physical servers were. I can tell you another story that prior to leaving, I got a call where people were saying, you're costing us way too much with your physical storage space, and we're going to kick you off. And I said, great, can I talk to IT? And they said, we are IT. And I said, but I'm a cardiologist, and then I realized, we were running into an issue. But now we don't talk about that anymore, right? It's how we compute. And really taking advantage of this new data, more compute, and the ability to have increased accuracy. So I'm going to go through the examples with diabetes and then the examples with baseline. So what do we think about when we think about diabetes? Diabetes is genuinely a pandemic. There are millions of people, over 642 million people forecasted to have diabetes. We know that when people have problems with their glucose, they can have problems with their eyesight, their heart, their kidneys, their peripheral nerves. And it's an idea, and this is an area where there's been a lot of investigation to think about what are the pathways. So the biological problem with diabetes is that glucose is not regulated and there's downstream negative effects. And so what we started to think about at Verily is what kinds of tools, technologies, whether it's on the hardware side or on the algorithm side, would be able to improve patient outcomes. And so we've tackled it in 3 different ways, and I'm using them just as illustrative examples as you think about this kind of work in your own world. One of them is to think about glucose sensors. So right now, continuous glucose monitors, that graphic that I showed you with the biology that's changing, is not standard of care for most patients with type 2 diabetes. And we'll talk about why. But it's really important to understand what's truly going on at the biological level. We'll talk about how do you then take those insights to a program like Onduo and help people manage their care. And then finally, how do you actually start to do things that get ahead of disease? And we'll talk a bit about diabetic retinopathy screening. So on the device side, one of the people that I'm closest with at work spends a lot of time thinking about how do we miniaturize biological sensors. And this can be something as we have a program working with contact lenses, we have a program working with small peripheral electroceuticals. Interestingly, a lot of the engineering principles are similar. We're just able to leverage it across different platforms. And one area, again, because diabetes is such a pandemic, one area that we felt really strongly about entering was thinking about how do you create a continuous glucose monitor that is smaller. So right now, many patients, they don't mind, there's a small inserter, but it's pretty bulky. So people have that's the piece that they complain most about. How do we make this a device that's not just for a very small fraction of the population? I mentioned that mostly it's patients with type 1 diabetes, but how do you lower the cost? And there's been a lot of interesting innovation and engineering there. I'm sure many of you in the room are working on it. Something that's disposable, waterproof, and it also starts to incorporate other sensors. So not just glucose, but things like activity. And so what we've been able to do is work with Dexcom on the world's smallest CGM. And the way we think about it philosophically, it's not the tool unto itself, it's the information that comes off of it. That's really where the power starts to unlock. And so what we needed to do is think about, okay, so you have the signals that are coming from this continuous glucose monitor. But the signals aren't relevant unless you know what to do with them. And so the signals will be coming off the monitor. What you're looking at in the second image is the cause and effect that people will start to see. And just one anecdote, what we've learned from people who are working with us on this program is they absolutely love the photo feature. What we can do now is just tap into standard ImageNet. People take pictures of their food. Food is then classified. We give nutritional content. But it's amazing how there's hooks that you wouldn't normally think about that people end up really enjoying. But the piece that was new is instead of, if I were to see you in clinic, what I would say is, thanks so much for coming to clinic. I want you to do these 10 things. I want you to eat low carbohydrates, exercise, you have to take your insulin, your medicines, get your eyes checked, your feet checked. Oh, and by the way, there's 10 other things you need to do, and it's really hard. The other thing is that's not unique. That is the generic advice that any one of you would get. When you start to take these insights and pair it with how an individual is reacting to a certain food product, for example, we're seeing big differences with how people respond to bananas. Or some people, their glucose won't go up with cookies, for example, and they get very excited. But this idea, all of a sudden, you're starting with this information to understand biology in a new way, and then pairing it with someone who can help their care. And the reason you can start to do this starts to get back to the compute. If you're really worried about where you're computing and you don't have the ability to upload real-time data in a seamless way and have algorithms that start to look at the glucose all the time, there's no patient and there's no physician. Again, if you talk to clinicians, we talk about this big data revolution, it's going to be amazing. You usually get a very angry reaction. But people get really happy when you say, no, don't worry, this isn't something you're going to have to look at. But you start to build learning algorithms that understand those patients. And so this is an example of a patient with their CGM tracings. And you start to cluster the different tracings. And so you'll see, let's say this is a cluster of Wednesday mornings. And what we're starting to see is a cluster of Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday mornings. And all of a sudden that insight, again, we no longer are manually labeling, this is all now done with algorithms. It will say there's something going on Wednesday. And so this is an area that you have to start to pay attention to. And so this idea of treating patients generically, we talk a lot about guidelines. There's still going to be guidelines, but this starts to change the dynamic when it's about your body, your glucose, what you need to do on Wednesday, and how you can change your outcomes. And so this is an area where a lot of people today, if people ask me, they say, okay, I really want to, I want to do something, and I want to do something where it has impact in the next months to years. A lot of times people are focusing now on signals that come off these kinds of devices. Things like continuous glucose monitors. There's a lot of work being done with atrial fibrillation and arrhythmia detection. We have a program going on there. Some people will go, they'll work at big device companies because, again, there's the device and there's information coming off of the device, and it's just an entirely new set of algorithms that are being developed. So in addition to that, so I will say that the program itself has now led to significant reductions in poor cardiac outcomes, in poor diabetes outcomes. But the holy grail really is to get ahead of a problem, to diagnose something before it happens. So not when someone already has diabetes or has what we call diabetic retinopathy, but actually to screen. The problem is we actually don't, we have a mismatch between the number of people who can actually detect diabetic retinopathy in patients who should undergo screening. And so this is just to show you one of the major complications of diabetes, diabetic retinopathy. The image is on the left. There's no diabetic retinopathy. The ones on the right is severe proliferative diabetic retinopathy. These people are at incredibly high risk of blindness. This is a problem in the United States, but if you remember the map I showed, this is a huge problem across the board. But the interesting thing, I'll take a quiz. So I won't offend anyone here because I don't think anyone here is an optometrist. Is there any ophthalmologists? Optometrists? Okay. So I won't put you, I won't put you under pressure yourself. So when we end up, we were doing some testing and looking at the matching between, so let's say we're both ophthalmologists, and I don't know, did Greg cover this when he came? Greg brought it? Okay, all right, I wanted to make sure we weren't cheating. So if you and I were both grading the images, what percentage of the time do you think we would agree with one another? Got 60? Okay, it's 60%, nice. So 60% of the time people will agree with each other. Now, if you go to very specialized centers where people are reading and they're used to reading the same, the numbers can go up. But when you think about making a diagnosis like that and you're relying on human grading, it becomes challenging. The next question would be, since we're on a roll here, what percentage of the time? What'd you say?
My mom's ophthalmologist.
Oh, okay, we got a family member who's in the industry. What percentage of the time do you think your mom would agree with herself? Okay, her mom's 80%, I think her mom's 90%, but most people it's about 65%. And the reason why is these images, you're reading hundreds of those. So I'll tell you, when I was a cardiology fellow, what we would do is we'd take these huge stacks of electrocardiographs, the ones I showed you at the beginning, and we would read them manually. And by the end, it's just, the human body has been trained to do so many phenomenal things, but repetitive image detection and anomaly detection is likely not our strongest suit. So what we did is we ended up thinking, okay, so these are images, right? There's images, there's diagnoses, there's a gold standard. And what many of these companies, including Google, had spent a lot of time on is image classification, right? And so using many new principles to say, how can you actually sub-classify? And the same principles that people are using for ImageNet can be used for medical images. it doesn't work, and I'm happy to chat about this in the Q&A. There's some places where it's really primed, and then there are other places where I think when people say, oh, AI is going to take over primary care, if you hear that, that's just, in my opinion, entirely way too much hype. There's too much noise in what is being done. But there's some areas where this type of work, if you marry diabetic retinopathy screening, you heard the statistics that we talked about a minute ago, and then you pair that with image classification, it becomes a really, really nice use case for these algorithms in healthcare. And what we've needed then to do, and this is work coming out from our Google colleagues, was to think about how do you actually look at the detection rates. And what was really interesting is that the algorithm's sensitivity and specificity was incredibly high. Again, it was trained across multiple different optometrists and ophthalmologists. And then there's just some quotes that I kind of find funny because I came from the traditional medical world where that it represents something new, but I also like the quote about it actually lives up to the hype, because a minute ago I did want to put a warning out there. There can be hype, but I think there are applications like this where it really will shift patient care. And what we've seen, and I think this is also a really important point, you can do a lot of work on interesting algorithms, but then how do you actually deploy these in the real world? And so I'll just walk you through practically what it means, because we wanted to create tools for diabetic retinopathy screening, not only in the United States, but also globally. And so we've worked with people, such as people in India. But what you need to do is think about what the camera is going to look like. And in fact, could you make a low-cost camera? So there's a lot of hardware that goes in. There's the algorithm itself. The FDA right now is trying to figure out how do you even regulate these algorithms that continue to update and advance. So there's really, if you have any regulators or people interested in policy, I think there's a really interesting field to go into. We're working on a program called the FDA pre-certification program, and they're just so eager to find people who have the technical background, who can then think about the right regulatory strategy, because it's very different. If you have a medicine or you have a device, we tend to know the potency, right? We know with the medicine, the pharmacokinetics and dynamics, and with the device, we know the principles and properties of that device. If you have an algorithm that's constantly learning and updating, how do you regulate that and make sure that, again, you're creating an end-to-end solution that's safe and effective? And then the final piece is how do you deploy it in entirely different care settings? But I will say I have been really encouraged seeing the clinical work that we're doing now, and the idea that instead of having, especially in resource-poor environments, instead of having people spend a lot of time taking the images and reading the images, having those images be done, and then people who really need access to care have that kind of access. The other thing is that as you start to apply these algorithms to things like fundus images and other images broadly, you start to discover other things, right? So we didn't go into this work thinking that there was going to be downstream predictive models around cardiovascular disease, but you can start to see, and I think there's a lot of poems and things about looking into the mind through the back of the eye, but it is actually true. It's amazing how much we're able to now see and detect the things, again, that we wouldn't be able to detect ourselves. The other thing is, this is just one example, but I wanted to see with you all, especially as you're focused on this area, how do you scale not just from ophthalmology, but thinking about pathology broadly. One of the programs I'm particularly excited about, not only is it reading the images in a new way, but it's detecting the images in a new way. Right now we take slides and we typically scan, we slice them and then we stain them and then we scan them. Looking with new tools, we're actually trying to do it without staining, and you train the different models, and then the algorithms actually auto-stain. So it's a hyperspectral microscope paired with algorithms that can stain slides. And that really, like that's a huge step change in terms of how we do things today. Radiology, though, dermatology, and things like endoscopy. So you're going to start to see these enter into clinical care in the near future. So we spent some time, I wanted to kind of open up this idea that there are many places where we could work today on known problems known algorithms, known devices, and there's a ton of work to be done. I think we've only scratched the surface. The other piece I'll say is particularly around, if you think about diabetic retinopathy, not only could you get people to the right follow-up, but then you could get them to be screened. So how do you auto-notify? It just changed the care paradigm. But I opened up intentionally by saying that there's a lot in healthcare that we don't know. And I think many doctors talk about both the art and the science of medicine, but I think there's a lot more that we can know if we start to change our concept of what is knowable. And so there was a mission that we went on as a group to think about what would health look like if you started to map it in a more comprehensive way and played off the mantra of we map the world, now let's map human health. But this has been one of the most interesting projects I've ever been part of. We work with Stanford, we work with Duke. It's a partnership with the American Heart Association. And most importantly, it's a partnership with the volunteers who are with us on this journey. And just about 3 months ago, we had one of our anniversary celebrations kind of just right across the way there. And I've been part of a lot of clinical programs and research programs. And typically, you'll have a lot of researchers and academics, maybe research coordinators come together, but this is really inverting the model. This was really about the people who are part of this journey and the participants leading the sessions. It's this idea of how do you co-design research and care. And so I just wanted to, in case any of you, maybe some of you may even be in the study, but we're so thankful to the Stanford community to be part of this. Because tomorrow's healthcare is not going to look like today, right? So this image on the left is showing you in 2017 what standard health records are. And we'll say, oh, this is a really big file. It's usually, if it's really big, it has a genome and it has a few MRIs. But in the not so far from now, there's expected to be about a 1,600-fold increase in health information per person. And so we can't be content with just dealing with today's tools. We have to start building that infrastructure to deal with this next generation health. And so what we started to do in this project, in Project Baseline, is to think about all the standard things that I talked about in clinic. So we're thinking about the electronic health record, claims data, which is the billing processes, lab data, so the genome, the proteome, the microbiome, the metabolome. What are those looking like? And what do they do over time? There's a lot of, I don't know if we have any microbiome researchers here. It's a really, really fascinating area, but a ton of work still needs to be done. Imaging, very broad imaging, but also what happens at home, right? So how are people sleeping? What is their behavior like? Are people taking their medications? And then remotely, some of the participants have actually opted into geolocation, trying to get a sense of what people are doing socially, how things are clustering. Again, this is done with full consent. People can opt in or opt out of different sections. But this starts to give you a sense, and I'll give you a practical example. A lot of times, if someone has a problem with their knee, we wait until that it's so advanced that someone needs knee surgery. What you can do actually is, as people have problems with different joints, they usually change their gait, right? So they're favoring one knee, or the way they walk up the stairs starts to change. In the study, people are wearing a study watch that has 17 different sensors. If you can start to pick up on these changes early enough, the hypothesis is that you actually could have someone engage in something like physical therapy, even remotely, instead of getting to the point where you have this very reactive and episodic care system. So I want to leave people with that idea that there is this world where we don't wait to see someone in the hospital. And that's, I should also say, that's the kind of medicine I practice today. I love being a cardiologist. I think it is such a phenomenally rewarding job. But every time I see someone, I think, gosh, I wish we could have done something ahead of time. So that is really where, if you wanted to ask for a big, bold 10, 20, 50 years, this is where the world is moving. And so what does that mean? What tools needed to be built? And some of them look relatively simple. I mean, we all are carrying around our phones, but in clinical trials, we weren't consenting people remotely. So we didn't have what we call Part 11 compliant consents or ID verification. So we built that. We work and talk to people constantly. It used to be, I'll go back to some of my Boston examples. So I was running one of the trials there, and The only way we really could contact people, we called them on the phone, there was no way to enter the data. One of the studies, people had to come and get their blood checked very frequently, again in the snow. And finally, people were just dropping out. What we're doing now is we're bringing the studies to them. We're doing remote phlebotomy, all of these things so that you can actually get this data set that ultimately unlocks discovery and improves care. The other thing, this goes back to why we always assume people have to come to us. Things like telemedicine have been around for decades. I grew up in a pretty small town in North Carolina where we really needed to have telemedicine because of remote care. But you see it now taking off because it's not just the telemedicine, it's linked with the records. There's much more of a closed loop system. The algorithms are how to prioritize patients. It doesn't really help if you do telemedicine exactly the same way you do in-person medicine. It doesn't really help anyone. But what we're doing in some of our programs now is you immediately are triaging people. If you look over the past 24 hours, who is having most of the problems, those are the people who are at the top of the list in terms of care, as opposed to, again, if any of you have ever worked in a clinic, you really just wait to see who comes in. People are usually given about the same time. So I think these kinds of technologies that are accelerating the world. And then thinking about sensor data broadly, I'm happy, as I mentioned, I'll leave time for questions, but talking more about, we build our own sensors. We also interdigitate with a lot of third-party sensors. But it's interesting, one of my biases coming into this job is I spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, in clinical trials and had done a fair amount of work in genetics and genomics, trying to understand why certain people respond to medications. And one thing that's really changed is I used to think in a more siloed way that there was genetic influences on the way someone will respond to a medicine or how they would present with a given condition. And now I just think about it as human signals. There's genetics, there's the microbiome, there's digital signals, there's heart rate. I mean, all of these it's just pieces of information that potentially can help someone in a more specific way. Happy to talk about biospecimen data. With the microbiome, what you need is a stool sample. As it turns out, not everyone wanted to collect a stool sample at home, but we ended up spending a lot of time with our user designers. I think that's also been a really interesting feature of how you design, and maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but how you design a stool kit that delights the user. We didn't quite get the same feedback as a cell phone, but there are ways where you can start to design with the person in mind. And then along the way, we built this registry, and so what we're starting to do is now run a lot of tests embedded in this registry, and it's amazing how many people want the opportunity to help forward science discovery and ultimately care. The other thing, so we started with the group at Stanford, and now what we've thought about is how do you build these communities, because we will never be able to apply all the algorithms that I showed you at the beginning unless we start to broaden these communities. The other thing that comes up a lot of times in algorithm development is what you are creating, is it going to generalize, right? And so we have all heard about the horror stories where certain predictive models were only trained in certain types of regions or with certain types of people and then don't work broadly, and yet we're trying to apply them clinically broadly. And so there's been a real push in terms of making sure that they're representative samples. It's been really important to partner with health systems. I think a lot of times, we were talking about one of the hackathons that happened here several years ago. I actually think the groups did an amazing job of pairing people with many different backgrounds together to say how would something actually get into the real world. But for us, I think there's been a really healthy dose of humility about how do you work with health systems to make these changes, and then more broadly with the ecosystem, how do you work with life science companies that are building next generation medicines, devices, digital tools, so that the best evidence can be out there. And so this is not something that I think any one individual or one group or one company can do. But the hope is that if we do this well, and if we start to accelerate this kind of work, if we start to think about next generation data and health, we can start to close that gap between clinical research, which is what we need to ultimately change clinical care. And the one thing I've always been so humbled by, and again, I'll go back to the event I came to a few years ago, is I believe that the talent is here. I mean, that it's everywhere, but it's definitely here to make these kinds of changes and this difference. So I just encourage all of you to be part of, if this interests you, be part of this movement, because there's more than enough work to do, and it's really rewarding to be able to go to work every day and a mission where you're really trying to help people. So I thank you for your attention, and I'll turn it over to questions.
So a lot of the projects are with traditional medical companies like Dexcom, etc. They also have their own engineering team. So how exactly does Verily fit into their products, and does working with them limit the pace at which you can iterate and deploy?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's really, and it's even a broader question. When do you choose to partner, and when do you choose to say, hey, we're going to go it alone? I'll talk broadly and then talk about that particular sensor. What we found, there are areas where you can end up making a bigger difference for clinicians and patients faster if you bring folks together with different skill sets. And so one example I turn to is around a program for surgical robotics, where we're working with Johnson & Johnson and Epicon. And there are certain pieces that they really have that were quite advanced, where we came in with some image acquisitions, a lot of the algorithm development. We've been able to accelerate that. If either one did it themselves, it just would take longer. The really nice thing about Dexcom is that they have had, there are certain pieces of their technology that are outstanding and best in class. There were things that we had that would accelerate all the 5 things that I mentioned there. And so in this case, it was much faster to work together. And so it's always an assessment. There are parts of the baseline platform where originally we thought about how do we do this in a little bit more of a distributed fashion, and really needed to work. The most important partners were our academic partners and the patients and participants, because we wanted to build tools quickly and iterate, and I think that would have been harder if we upfront had a direct, here's our next step. So I think partnerships can be really smart, but not if you're trying, as you said, not if you're trying, 2 things, not if you're trying to do something entirely different, and not if you're actually cannibalizing. If there's someone already doing that work, that can lead to a very unhealthy partnership. So we avoid those at all costs. Other questions?
Are there any wearables coming out that Verily is producing?
Yeah, so there are a number. They range everything from, so we just launched so I showed you the glucose, I showed you the care around that. In parallel, we've been working with pediatric and baby health. And so while I never initially thought about using the diaper as a monitor, we actually launched with P&G, because that's a great example. We're not a diaper company, but P&G is an amazing company, and so we have a product around sensing for babies. We're working and spending a lot of time on what's called the study watch. I don't think that one is really being done to understand new signals, and I suppose this is also a really important point. There's some tools, we're working on products that are detecting glucose or atrial fibrillation, which are known signals, but there's some products in the study watch that I think are going to show us entirely new biology. And so we have a series of programs in Parkinson's disease. And traditionally with Parkinson's, it's a clinical diagnosis, but it's quite subjective. And so what we're starting to see is that there's signals that you can get from the watch that are giving us a sense of someone's Parkinson's every day. So despite the fact that I'm a cardiologist and a huge fan of the arrhythmia function, I believe actually neurology is going to be one of the richest areas in terms of impact.
Yeah, there's some rounder.
Yeah, right, because there's different gait changes, there's so many different things going on, and the challenge is we actually titrate medicines right now to a static visit, as opposed to people are showing seasonal variations, what if someone has a flu at the same time, so I think there's a lot of potential there.
What are the current steps that really see when it comes to resolution of
So a question really around what steps are we taking from a regulatory perspective? Well, the one thing that's been really important is there's certain places where getting a 510K we follow standard practices. It is business as usual, and I think it's been really rewarding. In our very early stages, we were trying to say, do we have any capabilities
that we think would actually help people. When we made that decision, we quickly said, well, what are the operations systems that you need, the regulatory systems, the clinical operations, development. And so there's some things where we partner in, I would say, a very standard way with the FDA. We have an open door policy. But the program I mentioned, the FDA pre-certification program, is specifically designed around software as a medical device and around algorithms. And so we have been meeting and we are offering any advice that we can. We're also learning together. But that's an area, if you're interested in, I would just look up the pre-certification program because it gives you a sense of where is the current standards and where are things going. And I think I mentioned earlier, I really do think it's a fascinating area to be part of because we're going to start to see change. I mean, these are really new, it's new territory for everyone.
Yeah, I'm curious, who are the main drivers for new ideas at Verily? Because I can see some doctors being eager to suggest new ideas, but others being kind of hesitant to suggest ideas that might transform the workplace sometimes. So, yes, that works.
Yeah, so it is interesting. One thing I like about the environment is ideas come from everywhere. It's an incredibly open form that way, but then you need a mechanism to, if every idea is good, then no idea is really good, right? And so we're very open to lots of different ideas, but then what we typically do is go through and think about, there's some things where we intentionally say, is this something that can be addressed in the next 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 plus? So you want to get a sense of the time frame, and then you want to get a sense of the feasibility. And I think in general, we tend to have a pretty big mission of we want to do things that either are really challenging from an engineering perspective or biological perspective because that's, I think, where the big changes will be. So we go through, it's a bit of a matrix to figure out which pieces and where we go next, and making sure the other thing that you have a balanced portfolio. You wouldn't want everything, you wouldn't want to say trust us in 50 years, it's going to be amazing. I think that wouldn't be probably very beneficial overall, and it's certainly for people who are working in a company, they want to see sort of some rapid impact, but also some longer term projects.
And do you think that medical students are prepared for that amount of data? If not, what are you doing to promote more whole range between medical professionals and engineers?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things that we can do as a community is make sure people in life science and in healthcare are partnering directly with engineers and with designers, because the other thing is to be really good at your domain, but be humble enough to know, where here's. Sometimes what happens is people say, well, we've always done it this way, and to just be open enough to say, is there an alternative way of doing it? But there's another question embedded in there. It's what should training look like, right? What should medical training look like? What should if people are going into biomedical fields, and this is a really active topic, and the way I try to think about it is right now, we use echocardiography, CT, MRIs, there's a lot of technology in there, and we figured out the reason we adopt it so readily in the clinical profession is really helpful. And so if you do the same thing with the diabetes example, where we're not calling you every minute and saying there's an excursion or someone's hypoglycemic, but we only activate that information when it's clinically relevant, I think we'll adopt it. But it's not going to be, it's going to be with the same standards of everything else that we've ever adopted.
A couple of projects you mentioned rely on clinical data, and you guys obviously are having partnerships with hospitals, organizations. What's your sort of long-term strategy with getting access to clinical data for the long-term? There's been a lot of news recently about Ascension Health, and so it's sort of problematic. I think you guys are comfortable working with for the foreseeable future, or I think other strategies like opening up hospital Google or getting patients to get stuff right under fire. Is there sort of a long-term strategy other than partnering with Stanford?
Yeah, so some of the data is, as you said, an entirely novel data stream. I'll take a not so controversial example, something like continuous glucose monitoring. That's not a standard data stream that we get in hospital. But you raise a really important question of what about healthcare data broadly? And I think about it in two different ways. There are fully consented, and then there's de-identified data, which is where you're driving at a little bit. I don't think either group is going to go at it alone. I think we just have to create the right framework where people are really transparent about where the data is going. That's actually been one of our favorite things about Project Baseline, is that the people in the program are part of this journey, and we even are starting to do a thing that's not traditionally done in research, is we're returning results to participants. And so I think there are going to have to be these, I do still believe there's going to need to be collaboration, and this is done with Duke and Stanford for a reason. I don't think it's the best thing for everyone to kind of go into their corner and make it work. I don't think it's right it won't accelerate patient outcomes. Well, excellent. I think we have hit time, but I'm happy to hang around and answer any questions, and thank you so much.